Good evening, and welcome, and thank you all for coming this evening. I'm Douglas Druick, the President, and Eloise W. Martin, Director of the Art Institute, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers, Stephen Naifeh and Gregory White-Smith. Their names are no doubt familiar to you, as their most recent book and the subject of tonight's presentation, Van Gogh, The Life, has been well and widely received, and is already being heralded as the definitive biography of one of the most fascinating artists who ever put brush to canvas. Mikiko Katunani in the New York Times called the book magisterial, and in the Wall Street Journal, Jonathan Lopez praised the author's boundless ingenuity. The authors and this book have been featured in virtually every newspaper in the United States and have been additionally featured on 60 Minutes, PBS, and National Public Radio. The praise for Mr. Naifeh and Mr. Smith's work is well-deserved. Given access to previously untapped primary resources, they have worked for a decade to illuminate the development and flowering of Van Gogh's troubled genius, delving deeply into the family relationships, his psychology and mental condition, and, of course, his art. One of the major achievements of the book is the author's ability to take this prodigious research and transform it into a gripping narrative, writing nonfiction literature at its best. These are the same qualities that Mr. Naifeh and Mr. Smith brought to bear on their biography of Jackson Pollock, which was published to similarly great acclaim in 1989. In 1990, they were awarded the Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction, and that book was also a finalist for the National Book Award. Their landmark biographies of artists are, however, only one aspect of their remarkable careers. They are both graduates of Harvard Law School and have co-edited the important reference works, The Best Lawyers in America and The Best Doctors in America. They have also collaborated on 18 novels, 4 of which made the New York Times bestseller list. In all, they have demonstrated a capacity and capacious and roaming intelligence that has served readers seeking everything from best medical care to an absorbing novel to landmark works of history and art history. Their presence here tonight is especially meaningful to the museum, which, as you know, holds a significant collection of works by Vincent van Gogh, and for me personally, because I too have shared their fascination with Van Gogh and have found the artist and his life a source of curatorial inspiration and inquiry. It was exactly 10 years ago when the exhibition that Peter Zegers and I organized, Van Gogh and Gauguin, the Studio of the South, was on at the Art Institute, that I first met Steve and Greg, who were at that moment just beginning on the journey that has led to the book that we celebrate this evening. I'm delighted to have them here to mark that extraordinarily successful journey's completion. The authors have generously agreed to sign books after tonight's presentation, and you will find the books for sale in the lobby outside the auditorium. And I hope that you will also pay a visit to the galleries this evening to see our remarkable collection of works by Vincent van Gogh, in what promises to be in a new light following the new discoveries made in this biography. So without further ado, I would ask you to join me in welcoming tonight's distinguished speakers, Stephen Naifeh and Gregory White-Smith.
Hello, and it sounds as if this microphone is working. And I want to begin by thanking Douglas Druick for that incredibly kind and overly generous introduction. I could have listened to that for about 2 or 3 hours, I think. So if you'd rather retake the stage. One of the things that struck us when we began work on Van Gogh was that having spent 10 years on Pollack had died only in 1956, and we began work in 1980. And so the people who had worked on Pollack Many of them knew him. It was a very small circle. They were incredibly territorial. They didn't want anybody else into their circle. And the very first person we met when we launched this activity was Douglas Druick, and he and Peter Seizures had completed this glorious exhibition here at the Art Institute, which also traveled to Amsterdam on Van Gogh and Gauguin, and we were having fought our way through the Pollack Wars, just stunned at how welcoming and gracious he was, and that really set the tone for the rest of the next 10 years, where virtually everybody we met, both in the Van Gogh Museum and outside of it, welcomed us despite the fact that we had not done any work on Van Gogh before that. So we would like to thank Douglas and Peter for bringing us here to the Art Institute of Chicago this evening, and to Gloria Groom, who we've known for some time and who's one of the glorious people in the art world, and to Mary Sue Glosser, who arranged this lecture. We thought we might begin with a brief discussion of how Greg and I met and how we ended up writing biographies of artists.
Yeah, I hope this is going to work. We tested it earlier. Let me know if you can't. Somebody raise their hands if they can't hear me. Steve and I met at law school, the first day of law school in 1974. And we had three things in common. One, we loved biography. We both loved biography. We both loved the arts. Steve was been an art history student at Princeton, and he was an artist himself, and still is an artist himself. And I loved music. And the third thing was that we both knew we did not want to be lawyers. So we naturally bonded, and over the next 3 years, by the time we graduated from law school, we had written our first book. And then we went to New York, and we sort of wrote a number of things. You heard a brief summary, and I wouldn't want to go any further into that oeuvre, that part of our oeuvre, because we were paying the rent, and we just wrote what we could get paid to get written. And but we at all that time, we started work on Pollack, because it was sort of the work we kept in the drawer to work on, that we thought it was really expression of our true ambition as writers. And so we've spent about 10 years doing that. And finally it was published in 1990.
If I could say a word about Pollack very briefly, because not only do you have this absolutely extraordinary collection of Van Gogh, one of his most spectacular self-portraits, the Berceuse, which if along with the sunflowers may have been the most meaningful painting to him personally, the bedroom, which is one of the glories of his creation, the grapes, which distill, to use his own phrase, Vincent's, they just strike us dumb with how beautiful they are. One can go through the whole group of them. You also have two really, really important Jackson Pollocks. The drip painting is as good as it gets. And the painting from the Acabonic series is lovely and sweet beyond belief. With Pollack, what was so exciting about it was that he was born in 1912, died in 56. We began the book about 1980, so everybody that he knew in his life his contemporaries would have been about 70. Which meant that he himself was dead, his closest brother Sandy was dead, and a very few close friends were dead, but almost everybody else was alive. And we had just read Robert Caro's stunning biography of the first volume of his book on Lyndon Johnson, which many of you may have read, and we saw how he recreated Johnson's early life by going and meeting the people and interviewing them. And we were, Pollack's three brothers were still alive, his wife was still alive, his closest friends were alive, some of his psychiatrists were alive. We interviewed over 800 people, and it was so exciting because you would go and you would find things that were not written down anywhere. It was like archaeology. We were making new discoveries every day, and it was a thrilling exercise. But go ahead.
If I may, we were already struck then by the fact that there was this major figure in American art, Jackson Pollock, and there had been no definitive biography of him. And that was a feeling that came back to us 10 times over when after we won the Pulitzer Prize in 1991, and we started looking around for another subject. We thought, well, who are we going to write? We wanted to do another biography of an artist, and we thought, well, who can we do? And we developed a sort of question system about well, how do you pick a subject for a biography like that? And we thought, well, first, they have to have the art they did had to be important enough, significant enough in the history of art history to be worth 900 pages. The second criterion, I guess, was that the life had to be interesting enough to support a 900-page story. You'd be amazed how much really, really wonderful art has been made by people who led essentially boring lives. And which makes for wonderful, it can make for wonderful art, but not necessarily a good read. And then the third criterion was that it hadn't already been done. It isn't, and what we found, as we found with Pollack, was that there were figures of the stature of Abraham Lincoln in their fields, in the field of art, who had never had definitive biographies written, and to our amazement and astonishment, the artist we most wanted to write a biography of was Vincent van Gogh, and we thought, oh, there's no way that he hasn't had the definitive biographical treatment. And lo and behold, he had not had the definitive biographical
We sort of knew this, but we thought we really better check it out because maybe we just, something has slipped by us, and we opened the Encyclopedia Britannica, which you may know has little bibliographic entries at the end of their essays, and at the beginning of the Van Gogh bibliography, it says there has been no definitive biography of Vincent van Gogh. So we felt fairly comfortable in moving forward. There was, however, a huge hurdle, and that was that we did not speak Dutch. And we were not fortunate enough to have a Peter Zegers joining us on this odyssey who did speak Dutch. We felt it was a little bit like two Dutchmen showing up at the Library of Congress who spoke nothing but Dutch with the ambition of writing the definitive biography of George Washington. It was really an act of great kindness and optimism that when we arrived in Amsterdam, the people at the Van Gogh Museum, instead of thinking, who are these two crazy Americans who think they can do this, they really opened up their arms and welcomed us into the institution and gave us stunning access to the materials. Because the fourth criterion, our copy editors often have problems with our diction, is the availability of material. I mean, it doesn't matter if an artist is unbelievably important, had a stunningly good life, hasn't had a really great book written about them, but you can't find out enough to make a story. If you're William Shakespeare, the desire to know is so overwhelming that you can get a will in the world where somebody can tease out of the tiniest little fragments of information in conjunction with the plays, will in the world. But in the art world, that would be a little tougher to do. But fortunately, with Vincent, there was really essentially a unique body of material that allowed you to get inside someone's head. And that head was the fascinating, unbelievably complicated, unbelievably brilliant head of Vincent van Gogh. And Greg spent, we'll talk about how humongous the amount of material there was out there. In fact, I should say that one curator of a very major museum, so this won't, I think, identify this person, I won't mention gender, said the reason we weren't offended that you were trying to come into our midst and write the ambitious book was that none of us wanted to do it. She said, I guess I've let that go. She said, we all knew how big the ocean was to paddle across, and none of us wanted to make the voyage. And we thought, well, these guys have some credentials. They did the book on Pollack, so maybe they're up to it. And they have the even more important advantage that they're both naive and ignorant enough to launch into this because they don't know just how big the struggle is going to be. And
So our naivete was a big
so our
plus.
naivete was the huge plus there. The letters are extraordinary. Greg spent a year and a half of his life, 10 to 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, doing nothing but reading Vincent's own letters, and they presented it's so interesting to read the press on yourself, and there's been a lot of press, over 600 articles, and one of the people said, why bother to write a biography of him? They're his own letters. You can read about him in his own letters, and I think Greg can talk to you about the problems of reading letters and why reading them alone, even though everybody should, because they're a great work of literature, they are not an adequate biography.
Well, let me put that in the framework of the sort of incredible mountain of research that faced us as we embarked on this effort, and this was in about 2000. And we had Vincent's letters, which there are about over 700, and they're often quite long, and they're mostly, almost all of them to his brother, some to his sister, but mostly to his brother. And they were complicated in the way that all communications between siblings are complicated. I don't know how many of you have siblings, and maybe there are a few exceptions out there. But in general, the complications of a sibling relationship affect how the brother, in this case, the two brothers talked to each other. Theo was the younger brother. He was the beloved brother. He was the good boy. He was the normal brother. He was the favorite of the mother, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Vincent, of course, was the black sheep. He was the one who was always getting in trouble. He was the one who they thought was crazy, or at least unconventional, eccentric. He was always embarrassing the family, that sort of thing. So they couldn't have come from the family from different angles. And that relationship, that sort of what Vincent called a false position vis-a-vis each other, affected all their correspondence. And all too often, the readers of the correspondence, and I agree with Steve that the people should read them, and they're full of wonderful things, real insights, and wonderful record of his artistic process, less reliable as a record of his life. But they're also basically about his relationship with Theo. So you have to constantly read them as arguments to Theo about, oh, Theo, I'm really doing all right. Theo, people really like me here, you don't have to worry. Or, alternatively, Theo, if you don't send me more money, it's going to really affect my psychological stability. Theo, I'm going to embarrass the family if you don't send me more money. And he would construct these elaborate arguments that would sometimes go over letters that were all designed, sort of came to the same conclusion, which was, Theo, send me some money. So you have to sort of discount a lot of the voluminous number of letters and all that writing for the fact that he was dependent entirely on his brother for his support, and Theo was his only friend in life. So this love, and it was a genuine love between them, was endlessly compromised by the positions in which they found themselves vis-a-vis their parents and each other. So, in other words, you had to read everything through the prism of that complicated layer of fraternal relations. So it was really more like a deep textual analysis as much as a recording of the events. So that was my job, and we can gloss it all we want, but the real reason that was my job is because I'm a slow reader, and Steve, on the other hand, is a very, very fast reader. And so he handled the other giant piece of the work, of the research, and that is Vincent was not only a incredibly prolix letter writer, he was also a voracious reader. So he read in French, Dutch, German, and English, and he read almost all the great authors in all four of those languages. He read them in their entire oeuvre. So he would pick up a book by Balzac and decide he wanted to read all of Balzac. The same with Zola and Dickens and Schiller and Uhland, and memorized swaths of poetry in all those languages, and remembered quotes in all those books he read, thousands. In addition to all that, he had this incredibly photographic memory. So here you've got this guy who's reading like 3 books a day. He read all of Shakespeare and then would sort of dive into it again and read it all again. It's hard for me, at least, as a slow reader, to imagine the speed and the volume with which he consumed literature. But he also, and the sort of third piece of this work, was he also looked at images his whole life, from his childhood all the way through. He was looking at images and looking at from the children's books, emblem books they used to have, to illustrations of the Bible, Rembrandt's famous illustrations, to prints they had on the walls. He would go to museums and look at paintings. And even though they didn't have the advantage of books, Prince books, and they had some print books, but mostly if you went to a museum and you saw a painting, you saw the painting and then you walked out the door. You didn't have a catalog, an exhibition catalog. And yet, and on top of all those things, the incredible reading and the incredible seeing, he had this unbelievably photographic memory. So 30 years later, he could remember going to a museum, some obscure museum somewhere, and seeing a painting by, say, Frans Hals. And he could remember a passage in the corner and exactly the color. It was a certain shade of gray, and it related to the shades around it in a certain way. And he remembered the way the brushstrokes were laid on. He remembered the face of a peasant that was turned slightly away, and just remembered these things. It's just stunning to me. And because it's there in the letters. And in the letters you also find these references to books he read, just passages, 4 or 5 words that come out of the book that he just kept in his head all these years.
Well, the reason all this is so important is that Vincent, these paintings are so beautiful. They are so vibrantly colored. The messages, the sort of metaphors are so immediate and graspable that they are perhaps the most popular images on the face of the earth. I mean, it is hard to think of any other artist who is as beloved as Vincent van Gogh. I mean, there are as many as 500,000 people a year who visit his grave in Auvers, and it's really almost a pilgrimage. Visitors, they have to go clean the grave every day because people will bring notes where they write little messages for Vincent. Artists will bring painting equipment, their brushes, and lay them on the grave. Jewish visitors will put rocks or stones on the headstones. Russian visitors will pour vodka on the grave, which is apparently a Russian way of venerating someone who's passed away. And most astonishingly of all, Japanese visitors will bring the ashes of their ancestors to pour on the grave of Vincent van Gogh so that they can spend eternity with the painter of Starry Night. I mean, this is a level of emotional connection that is really unlike anything we can think of. Even Monet or Renoir or Rembrandt or all the other big names that we think of as being, hugely loved by many, many people. The connection with Vincent is immediate and visceral for people from all over the world, whether it's Africa or South America or Asia or Europe or the United States. It's everywhere. It's small children respond to him. We talked to a curator at the Van Gogh Museum. We talk constantly, why is he so popular? And one curator who had small children said, I think it's not because Dad works at the Van Gogh Museum. I think it's because the paintings are so authentic. There's no, children have this wonderful way of detecting inauthenticity in adults or in situations, and they look at a Van Gogh painting, and unlike the incredible sort of cerebral calculations in a magnificent painting by Gauguin, the Van Gogh is immediate and visceral and honest, and children get that. But he's also beloved by people who are a whole lot older than children.
And more sophisticated.
And it also, he appeals not only to the people who are sitting here in this audience who come to museums and look at paintings and know brushwork and know color and know how to analyze it and how to appreciate it, but there are people who have posters by Van Gogh on their dorm room walls who may never have been in a museum before. And so he has this unbelievable immediate appeal, but Vincent himself believed strongly in the 19th century notion that, as he would, actually as Zola put it, he quoted Zola, that the man behind the canvas is more important than what you see in the canvas. He believed profoundly that knowing who the painter was and knowing something about his or her life really helps you connect with that painting in a powerful way, which is why we felt our obligation to present him as fully and thoroughly as possible would possibly help people get even more out of those paintings. But there was another layer, and that is these seemingly simple images are incredibly elusive. Not elusive in the sense of being hard to understand, although they take some work if you want to get this extraditional meaning, but they are elusive in the sense that he alluded to this vast outpouring of images that Greg mentioned and this enormous body of literature that Vincent had in many cases committed to memory. A great example, without going into huge detail, is lying upstairs in La Berceuse. Well, it also lies in the sunflowers, too.
Can I
Go ahead.
for a second and just sort of say that where I was talking about all the images he'd seen and books he'd read and that sort of thing, and to tie in with what Steve's saying, that one of the great challenges of the book was to try to unpack these images. And to understand what I mean by that, I need to, most of you probably remind you that he lived to be 37. His entire artistic career was 10 years, the last 10 years of his life. And most of the great images that you can bring to mind, many of the great images that are flashing back up here, are from the last 2 years of his life. So, there was this long period of gestation where he was just vacuuming up all these images and literature images that he had seen in paintings and in prints, and then suddenly, in this last period, especially in the last few years, after he left Paris, let's say, that suddenly all that begins to sort of undergo this indefinable process of digestion, and then come flowers in the last few years of his life. So the challenge for us was to understand everything that went into his imagination in all those years of learning and developing and seeing and appreciating and keeping in his imaginary museum. And in order to understand what ultimately came out of his imagination in those last great years. And Berceuse is a great example of that.
Yeah, because without going into all the different meanings, when Vincent saw that painting, he thought of Pierre Loti. Pierre Loti, you may or may not have heard of, but he was in the 19th century, to our mind, Vincent had a voracious appetite. He once said in one of his most generous comments, people don't admire enough, admire more. Mm-hmm. And he admired not just Harriet Beecher Stowe's great classic Uncle Tom's Cabin, that led him to all of her, I would say, lesser novels, and he loved those too. And he loved Loti, as most people in the late 19th century did, because he was sort of the National Geographic of the time. In his novels about life in other parts of the world, he would sort of reveal Tahiti or Japan or to people, and he wrote a painting called Île de Pêcheur, or the Fisherman's Island, which was basically about fishermen going to Iceland. And he was living with Gauguin at the time, who had been a sailor, and there were these ceramic figures of the Virgin Mary that provided consolation to to sailors who were in rough-hewn seas and could die in a shipwreck. And so the painting for him has the additional meaning of consolation that comes by reference to this piece in Lodi, and it would take us far more time than we have now to go through all the other additional references that are going on in those paintings, but which make them an unbelievably rich experience.
He took the title from a book by Frederick von Eden, which is hardly a book. I didn't know the book before we did this research, but
and there's also,
which means that it refers to both the woman who rocks the cradle and the woman who sings the lullaby to the baby.
But there's also the meaning from his life, which is, this refers back to what we were saying Zola had said, which is the man behind the canvas is as important as what you see in front of you. Here is a painting called The Lullaby, La Berceuse, which is about a mother and her child, but it is, if you think about it just for a moment, the child is not visible. The child is in a cradle that is off canvas, and the rope that the woman is holding to rock the cradle is slack. And to find out that he had this absolutely just shockingly unhappy relationship with his mother is to realize that this lullaby is really a painting of yearning for a mother who doesn't love her child.
Well, let me interrupt and say that what we're really trying to do, rather than give you a disquisition on La Berceuse, is give you a sense of the layeredness of all this art. And it's incredible, as Steve said earlier, its allusiveness and how that enriches the experience of the art. That's really what we tried to do in the book, is to give the reader enough of this of his life, both his life, emotional life, and of his intellectual life, so that all of those as those elements come together in this great art, you can see that and yet still appreciate it as the beautiful painting on a canvas that it is.
Fair. One thing that, because we want to leave some time free for some questions and answers, but Greg, I thought it might be helpful if you would describe a perception that you had about one of the other reasons why we think his paintings are, and you see it in the grapes upstairs, as you see it in but particularly in those grapes, they just hit us. We just went upstairs and looked at your glorious collection of Van Goghs.
Also the Poets Garden.
And
same in the Poets Garden. Anyway, this is sort of a little back and forth. I hope you don't mind it. It's
this is how we write.
Process.
You're getting a very good sense of how two authors work together.
You can see why it took 10 years to write the book. Among the many challenges of writing the book, which we've been talking about, one was the mythology that has grown up around Van Gogh. And everybody, just as everybody knows certain images, they also feel like they know the life. They know about his, many people know that he had a pastor for a father. Many people know he wanted to be a preacher. Certainly know that he cut off his ear, part of his ear. And most people think that he tried to commit suicide. And these details, these biographical details, sort of fix the images I think, in our collective cultural memory. So one of the reasons why they've stayed there so indelibly is because we have this image of this very unhappy artist who was not appreciated and led this miserable life, and yet created these incredible, joyous images. And that's a very powerful, indelible sort of image.
If I can just jump in, one of the reasons we think there's almost you often see people almost have a kind of reverential experience of these paintings, and we think that what's partly going on is the subconscious knowledge that everybody brings because of the details of the life that Greg just mentioned, and the self-portraits are deeply sad. I mean, that magnificent portrait upstairs, this is not a happy person. So just to know the self-portraits and to know the bare outlines of his life is to know that he was an unhappy person. And trust me, you can't begin to imagine how miserable this life was. It was far more miserable than you can possibly imagine. The misery knew no bounds, and yet the fact that the fact that he was able to extract from this deep well of sorrow that was his life these jubilant images is a message to all of us who may not be as miserable as he was, but who have our daily problems. That there is beauty and wonder and magic in life, no matter how terrible your daily situation may seem.
So
and this was not, even though that process may not be conscious for us as we experience the paintings, it was incredibly conscious for Van Gogh himself. He had wanted to be a preacher, not because he wanted to write treatises on the Bible. We're not entirely sure how much he actually believed about the sort of Christian, the full Christian message. But for him, certainly, the main reason to become a preacher was to follow in his father's footsteps and to provide comfort and consolation to people. And he wanted those paintings to provide consolation and comfort to people. And of course, one of the sort of miracles is that he did so on a scale that would have left him. He simply could not have imagined the 850,000 people lining up to see the show in Los Angeles, or the equivalent number in Seoul, Korea, or the 1.5 million people who go to the museum every year. He provided that level of consolation. But one of the perceptions we've had after the book was written was came to Greg in this last year.
Well, it's really about all of this talk about the relationship between his art and his life has to be careful. Partly because there is something of an anti-biographical, or has been for a long time, an anti-biographical bias in art history, a feeling that a painting is an object unto itself, and that it is the artist's life has no relationship to the image that you see, that paintings only relate to other paintings, and they all exist in this kind of Aristotelian world of forms, and they relate to each other, but they don't relate to anything that's going on in the base life of the artist who's actually painting them. Seems like a crazy idea to us, coming at it from the angle we did. I grew up in literature, and no one blinked at the idea that a writer's life was in his books or her books, and that, in fact, part of what a biographer did of a great writer was to try to find the characters and plots and themes in the books in the artist's life. This is the grist of the biographer's job. But in art history, it hasn't been that way. So as we go down this path, as we've gone down this path now with two artists, we end up at the very sensitive issue of Van Gogh and mental illness. And his, we believe, as his own doctors believed, that he suffered from something called temporal lobe epilepsy. And that is a mental affliction that is a non-convulsive epilepsy. And has nothing to do with the kind of seizures that we think of when we think of epilepsy. It happens entirely in the brain, and it affects only the highest brain functions, functions like memory and perception and the constituent elements of our identity. So that when you have a seizure, when you have temporal lobe epilepsy, you lose track of who you are, and you do things but you think somebody else did them. You turn the page of a book, but you don't think you did it. You think some other presence in the room did it. You can project yourself into other people and see yourself at a distance. So you just, Vincent himself described it as a fracture between consciousness and reality. And it was like a big void opened up in the middle of reality. And then at the other end of it, he would, when the seizure was over, he would often find himself manacled to a bed in a hospital and not sure what he had done, because typical of this illness is that you don't remember what happened during the seizure. And his neighbors in Arles would complain about him, and the police would descend on the house. They'd drag him off. They'd take him to the hospital. He'd wake up, and he'd think, what did I do? What am I doing here? It was after one seizure or during one seizure that he cut off part of his ear, and he woke up, bandages on his head and bloody in the fever ward of the hospital in Arles. So as you can imagine, this sort of feeling of, oh my God, when is the world next going to open up? When am I going to have another seizure? Because they came without warning. They could come multiple times a day, or they could come with months apart. So
but also
was,
each seizure made the next seizure more likely.
More likely. So there was this tremendous. They introduced into his life toward the end. We think he had seizures much more erratically and with much further spaced, much further apart in the earlier part of his life. But when we know he started having seizures with some frequency is in the last part of his life, he checked himself into an asylum in southern France. And as the disease got worse, everything got more fragile, and he felt more and more precarious about his own consciousness. And what Steve is referring to is that I've had, and I hesitate to say this because it's, I want to clarify that this is something that came to me this year after that part of the book was written, but it was, I thought, was sort of an insight into what he was feeling and how his experience of his illness affected his art. And that is that I've had a brain tumor for years and years and years and had it treated multiple times. But this year I had a series of emergencies which involved cerebral hemorrhages that just knocked me out, and I ended up in a hospital and an emergency, and then medevac to a medical center for surgery and ICU and on. That happened multiple times. And so what happened was, I don't want to box myself into a corner of sort of comparing these two situations, but what I realized from my situation was that the possibility that reality could be snatched away from you at any moment, with no warning, and you could wake up in some place not knowing what you had done, and or maybe not wake up, was incredibly intensifying of the experiences you had, so that everything you did, it was like, oh my God, what happens if I have an attack right now? What happens if I have a hemorrhage right now? Will I really get to remember this moment? Will I be able to see it better? And I think, and this is personal, that one of the things that gives his late paintings, those last 4 years of paintings, the incredible intensity they have, and you have many examples of them upstairs, is a sense as he began to feel more and more the possibility of a seizure at any given moment, that he had to capture what he was looking at as fully as possible, because he might lose it, he might never see it again. And so when he looked at a bowl of flowers or he looked at a starry night, he just looked at it intensely and felt the need to capture the feeling he had and the beauty of what he saw on the canvas right then, right there, right at that moment, because who knew if he would ever get another chance again. And the best example, I think, is in the spring of 1890. He went outside the asylum and he saw this gnarled old almond tree that had just come into bloom against a wonderful sort of light cerulean sky, and it had these beautiful pink blossoms. And he looked at it, and this is me not talking, not him, but my feeling is he must have looked at that scene, seen those beautiful pink blossoms against that blue sky and that wonderful, characterful, gnarled tree, and thought, oh my God, this is unbelievably beautiful. I've got to get this down. I've got to get it down in all of its glory, because I might never see it again. And in fact, he never did see it again. He died about 5 months later. So I really think that what we see and what comes through and what goes to the answer to the question we posed at the very beginning, which is, why is his art so meaningful to us, and why does it talk to us so eloquently and so convincingly now and across the globe, and will surely in another century, is that it really captures what it means to, what it feels like to be human, what it feels like to be conscious, and to what it feels like to look at something beautiful, not just not just the thing itself, but the feeling of what it is to enjoy that beauty and to really feel it deeply. That's just me talking.
Well, we would love to entertain some questions, and the lights are in our eyes in a way that I can't see anybody in the audience, so I wouldn't be able to see a hand.